Welcome to the monthly recording of Talking About Kids, done in conjunction with the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. Joining us from the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health is Celeste Krell-Colum. Hello, Celeste. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me join us
Thank
today.
And a familiar face to people who log in for these monthly webinars is Dr. Vinny Chulani. Vinny, how are you today?
Very good, Brad. Thanks for having us again.
You're welcome. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Debra Pepler as our guest today. Deb is a distinguished research professor of psychology at York University. In 1997, she appeared on an episode of Oprah Winfrey to start to talk about bullying and the problem and impact it has on kids. In 2006, she founded PrevNet, which stands for Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network, which is a collaboration between researchers and direct service providers aimed at stopping peer aggression and bullying in childhood and adolescence. In 2015, she was awarded the Donald O. Hebb Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology as a Science by the Canadian Psychological Association. And in 2019, she was named an Officer of the Order of Canada. And I have to say all this because she will never say any of that about herself, except for the Prev Network, which has been something that's been really important to her and her career. Um, Deb, I always ask my guests a little bit about what got them into this work to begin with. Can you share that?
I would be glad to. I graduated with my PhD, did a 6-year postdoc, and was not able to get an academic job. And so I ended up as the research director in a children's mental health center. And I thought I had gone sideways in terms of my career, but really I had stepped into a gold mine because I was face to face with the clinicians who understood the children, understood the children's problems, and were experts in the work that they did delivering services to children, youth, and families every day. And so since 1984, I have co-created research within clinical settings, community settings, educational settings, and over the last 20 years in Indigenous communities.
I should let everybody know that recently you have been spending a lot of time kind of looking back and synthesizing big themes in the course of your study, your publishing, your work. You and I have been able to do a little bit of that together. And this is going to be kicking off that series. So today is an overview, kind of a preview of these longer discussions that are to come. And the four larger discussions that are going to happen after this. One is going to be on kind of language and themes that run through all of kind of developmental psychology, and in particular, your developmental relational approach. And then we're going to be talking about applying it if you're a parent. We have an episode about applying it if you are a teacher or educator. And then finally, we have an episode about applying these themes if you're a direct service provider or a policymaker. So we're covering a lot. So anybody listening now that thinks that we're going to move through some of these really big issues too quickly, don't worry. Greater, more in-depth explorations are just around the corner. But let's start by, Deb, if you could, defining what you mean by a developmental relational approach.
I'd be glad to. I'm a developmental psychologist, and when you're developmental and have that perspective, you focus on the child. You focus on the child's strengths, where the child's struggling, uh, how the child is moving through the world, and really keep your eyes on the child and assess the child. But throughout my career, since I got my PhD, I've always studied children in the context of relationships. And so I very quickly learned when I was doing my 6-year postdoc with siblings, observing siblings in living rooms with their parents, and in my work in the clinical setting with highly aggressive children and their parents, as well as children living in families at risk, that you could never understand the child and understand the child's development without having another perspective on the child's relationship. So I think of it much as binoculars, that we look through one lens and can see the child's strengths and challenges, but the other lens relates to the quality of relationships and the capacity of relationships that that child's growing up in, and focuses on whether those relationships are are able to scaffold and support and nurture the child in a way that's going to build the strengths and help the child navigate the challenges that he or she is facing. And similarly, how those people relate to the child. Are they supportive and nurturant and respectful, or are they taking that child down and negative toward the child and undermining the child's growing sense of self and identity? So it's really the combination of those lenses. And when you put the developmental perspective with the relational perspective together, you see the child in 3D, in a sense, the way that binoculars enable us to see. You see the depth of the child's experience. You see the complexity in the child's life and how the child is developing and moving through the world.
And a big piece of how you believe children start moving through this world has a lot to do with their attachment to their primary care providers that gets formed very early in their life. For those of us who are still learning about attachment, can you kind of briefly define what attachment theory is?
Yes, I can. And it's really central to our understanding of early childhood development, but it goes through life. It goes
Mm,
through the lifespan, so that we as adults are attached to those people that whom we're close to. But it really means that you're in a relationship where you feel safe, where you feel that you can trust, where you feel valued and supported to navigate what it is that you need to navigate. Even if it's like an infant being hungry, being picked up and fed. Um, and the understanding of why this central attachment relationship is so important is because when you feel secure, you can move confidently out into the world and explore the world, which of course children need to do. Similarly, when things become challenging, you can rush right back to that secure base, it's called, and get comfort from the adults who are your primary caregivers. But if we think about adolescents, that's the way it is. If they have solid relationships with the family and go out into the world, but have a parent they can call if things aren't going so well, so that they can come back and get secure, um, then attachment's important. It's important in intimate relationships as adolescents move into those and through adulthood. So it's a lifelong process, but starts in infancy.
And, I think one of the kind of scarier things about attachment and a criticism that's often levied on it is that it almost seems like it's like determinism, right? That what you learn about relationships from at your earliest moments from your primary care providers sets you on a trajectory, or that's a criticism, at least, or a worry that people have about attachment. But in your work, you're always looking at how we introduce and strengthen relationships at any period
Yeah.
in somebody's life,
Mhm.
regardless of the attachment model that they had before that. Am I saying that correct, Deb?
I think you are. I think that we now understand that people can always learn and always change. But the difficulty for those infants and young children who haven't had secure relationships is that they learn that they really can't trust people, that they're on their own, that they need to be on high alert, and the world's a pretty scary place. And so, in order to support healthy development, you need to work with the child to develop the skills that they've been lacking, because when children require clinical treatment, it's often understood that they're really lacking some very basic skills, and so you can scaffold and build those skills for them. But you must also work, when it's a child, with their parents, or in the case of the school context and bullying, with their teacher, with their peers, to ensure that those relationships in which they're embedded are nurturant and trustworthy and secure. And I've worked for now 30 years in a program for substance using women and their young children. And this program has taught me so much, because the women were terribly abused as children, and most of them left home when they were 12 or 13 and got onto the streets and had really violent and unhealthy experiences in relationships. They come into the program not trusting anyone, and they're pregnant or with a very young child, and nor should they ever trust, because nobody has been trustworthy. And so it takes this caring, nurturant, relational program to hold the women and teach them what trust looks like and what it feels like, and then how to give it to a child, how to give this experience of caring and nurturance to a child. And the transformation for these women is extraordinary, but it takes 2 or 3 years to walk the walk. And for the women themselves, the understanding is that when people start to use substances, when you start to use substances, their development stops at that stage. So the woman might be herself 25, but she looks like a 12 or 13-year-old. And so she's making this developmental transition to become a 25-year-old in 2 or 3 years, rather than in 13 years. So there's where, again, the developmental relational perspective comes in, because you support the woman's development in the context of relationships. And if I can just summarize, what that really means is that healthy development depends on healthy relationships.
Relationships. Sure.
Yeah, I can't help but think about a lot of the young people you work with, Vinny, and their issues with trust, because what prior relationships have taught them about relationships. What do you want to add about that? Because I mean, I know that you and I have discussed in different contexts the fact that gaining that trust, especially from an adolescent who hasn't had relationships they could trust, is a bumpy road. It's not a straight path, is it?
Yeah, not at all. But Brad, there are other layers to this too. How we often, like, separate from relationships and attachments. Oftentimes we view adolescence as a period of vulnerability, as a period of storm and stress, and
Mm.
we oftentimes we view adolescence from a deficit-based perspective rather than a strength-based perspective. But also, like, in clinician relationships with adolescents, right? Like, as clinicians, we expect adolescents to be forthcoming and open, and really until we create that safe and secure environment. And it may not happen in one visit, which sometimes undermines our own sense of self-efficacy as clinicians, because we like to feel good at what we're doing. It really sets yourself up for, like, a potentially negative relationship. And so it really speaks to just the importance of trust building and creating that safe space. And if they don't let you in once, if they don't let you in the first time, you don't stop trying.
Or even if they test you, which if for a young person who has trouble with that trust issue,
For sure.
they might test you. They might decide, I'm going to see, is this an act that they're putting on, or are they really going to stay here, and are they really going to be present moving forward? And that can be difficult too for people working with young people. There is a question from the audience, Deb, and the question is, can attachments be harmful?
Yes, that's a very good question. So that when the early studies of attachment identified secure attachment, which was what I was talking about, but there are categories of insecure attachment. Some children become very avoidant and just dismiss their parents, don't seek help from them. Others become very anxious if the parent is not reliable and not present, and sometimes on, sometimes off. And some become, uh-oh, oh gosh.
We can still hear you.
Can you? I'm
Oh
so
yeah,
sorry.
that's
Um,
okay.
I am going to decline. Sorry, I apologize. I just should have put it on.
That's
Um,
okay.
um, and some children have what's called a disorganized attachment, and that arises when the parent is frightening,
Mm.
and the child just has no idea what to expect. The parent's unpredictable, they're frightening, and that's not surprising for people who themselves didn't have a secure attachment. So it's important to recognize that there are many ways of adapting to an attachment that's not nurturant and not trustworthy and not secure.
We've talked a little bit about, I mean, I think that this has been implicit in a lot of your answers, but do you have anything else that you want to add about the hallmarks of a healthy relationship? Like, what are we looking for? What are we looking to provide, especially to adolescents who are having to learn a new way of approaching relationships or having to learn to trust, having to learn that they can rely on somebody else to get their needs met?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on something that Vinny said because I think it was really important that adolescents need us to see their strengths. And I remember at the Oregon Social Learning Center, they spoke about children and youth needing 10 positives to every negative. And I think that's really important, that you can't build trust with a child if you're constantly criticizing them. So I think one of the aspects of a healthy relationship is that children feel valued and feel seen for the challenges that they face, for the mistakes they make, because of course we all make mistakes, so that are seen and valued, that they can trust you, that they know that you'll stand beside them even if they mess up, um, that that there's communication, that they can open up to you, and you'll open up to them and speak honestly about that. But I think one of the most important things is we distill all the current research, and especially the research on adverse childhood experiences, is that they'll help you buffer the inevitable challenges that you face as a child or youth. They'll help you navigate those, and they won't add stress to your life, because when we look at the adverse childhood experiences, each of those experiences that undermines well-being through the lifespan is an experience that would disrupt the child's relationships
Mm.
in the family context. And so I think we need to think very much about how we support children navigating difficult situations, but also that we don't ourselves, as the adults in their lives, whether we're teachers or parents or coaches or clinicians or community workers, we don't add stress to their lives.
Something else that you've written a lot about that's kind of central to your work is this notion of the bidirectionality of relationships. Can you give us a little primer, a tease on what you mean by the bidirectionality of relationships?
Well, it has to do again with the developmental relational perspective, and the child and the child's behavior impacts parenting capacity or impacts teachers' responses, and the way the parent or the teacher or the peer or the adult responds to the child shapes that child's behavior. And it's interesting because all children are different, needless to say, and some children are very challenging, and even children who aren't challenging are challenging at some times. And so it's important to think about how that child or youth is pushing you out of your comfort zone and pushing you and pushing your buttons. Adolescents do this brilliantly with parents and other adults. Just push the buttons, and how You need to stay regulated and true to the way you want to be in relationship with that child. Because if you're not very cognizant of that, if you don't think about it and are quite deliberate about it, you can be buffeted about by a child who's out of control and learning how to get attention in all the wrong ways. Similarly, you as the adult have a lot of influence over a child. So there's a lot written now about co-regulation in infancy, childhood. I think it also applies in adolescence, that you stay calm and regulated and present and listening to a youth who's really coming unstuck and sad about something or anxious about something. You can help provide those safety guardrails for them by staying regulated, being present, being listening, and attuning to them. And you, so that the effect between a youth and an adult, a caring adult, is what we call bidirectional. They impact each other over time.
So, Deb, I'm sorry if I might jump in. You mentioned something about um, sort of the importance of adults staying regulated. But like when I think of adolescence just as a developmental time period, even young people with the most secure of attachments will test limits,
Oh,
will
for
test
sure.
boundaries, and it really requires a different lens as well.
Thank you for raising that. They do, and that's their job to test limits. It's their job to break away from their parents and become their own people, and that feels terrible. The best way, I have three children who are through adolescence and into their mostly 40s, but I always understood that being a parent of an adolescent was like doing a dance, because at one moment they want you very close and right with them, caring and talking. And the next 5 minutes, if you're in the province or the state, you are too close to them. And you have to be willing to ride that wave with them and not be offended that they don't want you close, because they are testing they're testing their autonomy probably more than anything. Thanks for raising that.
Yeah. But when you talk about bidirectionality, the same way young people need to have confidence in their parents' relationships with them, parents also need to have confidence in their relationships with their children.
Mhm.
And I think this is where patience comes in, because you may not be close to your adolescent on some days, even if you had a beautifully close relationship. They all of a sudden recognize that you aren't really very smart and you don't know anything as a parent. And they know everything, and besides which, they really should be able to have a sleepover at their friend's house, which turns out to be a big party. And you just have to stay firm with your guardrails. But that being said, as the youth develops capacity and responsibility, and you develop trust in their decision making, you can back those guardrails up and give them more space to become themselves and to explore themselves, and help them pick them up when something's gone a little awry.
Vinny and Deb, I also think that it's worthwhile for adults to also look at how they're framing that relationship, either with their own child or with people in their program. There's a lot written about this, but too many adults are approaching those relationships as friendships, and they are kind of they're judging them based on how you would judge a friendship with a peer. What am I getting out of it? What's the feedback that I'm receiving from it? And that's not what our kids need. They need adults. And so like sometimes being the best trusted adult in the life of a kid means that they are going to be upset with you because of those borders and boundaries that you have to create for them. But it's a complaint I hear from too many adults that they're unhappy with their relationship with the child because it's not like a good friend. But it's not supposed to be.
Oh, I agree with you, Brad. It's not supposed to be a friendship. It's supposed to, you gradually, there's a power relationship with an adolescent. And, certainly with a young child, the parent has power and the child has less power. As the adolescent is capable of more power, the relationship becomes more equitable, but it's not the same as a friend. It's different. It's closer in some respects, and it's very, very distant in others, and that's okay.
Celeste, you've been very talkative this whole session. But I'm wondering, like, I know that you are thinking about how to put this information into practice with the youth that Affirm works with. What are your main takeaways so far as you go back and, interact with the Affirm youth?
Yeah, I think I have teenagers, so I definitely am right on that that cusp of things. And so I can also take away the biggest thing for me is trust. Developing that trust is a huge thing. And you do get tested, right? Like not only by my own kids, but I also was a teacher prior to this. So, you're a new teacher and you come into the classroom and they definitely want to push your boundaries. They want to see what they can get away with. So, um, I definitely like the idea of like I think Deb said kind of like standing your ground a little bit. So making sure you're staying firm in those areas where you need to, but also being able to adapt to each child in each situation. So really just taking that back to our providers and kind of delivering that message that we definitely cannot treat all kids equally, right? They're all different and everyone's socioeconomic backgrounds are different. So everyone is going to need to be treated differently to obtain that trust.
You made me think about a story, and I know I've told this on Talking About Kids before, and I've written about this too, but um, I was talking with a parent that couldn't figure out why her child, um, right when she's being dropped off at school in a car, opened the door and immediately challenged the mother in a way that the mother knew, like, that my kid knows that they can't do this. My kid knows this. And the kid's friends are there. And this parent was like, it was horrified. She's like, I didn't want to like give consequences to my kid at that moment, not in front of her friends. But what we figured out though was that that's exactly what her daughter wanted her to do. Her daughter needed her friends to see that her mother was strict and that there was limits and that her mother enforced them because, as it turns out, this young adolescent female, there were things that she was being asked or, some pressure that was being placed on her, and she was blaming the strictness of her parents as why she wasn't engaging in these behaviors that she didn't want to engage in. So she was giving this peer group proof that her parents are strict. It was very, very helpful. It felt horrible to the mother, but it was so helpful to that young adolescent at that moment. So know that that might happen with us too. Know that sometimes they want us to put the hammer down and set a limit because they're going to rely on that limit and they're going to get safety from that limit. Right? Well, Deb, we've just scratched the surface, and I'm looking at the clock, and we've already gone through our 30 minutes. But you've been so generous with me that we have another 4+ hours where we're going to go into these topics in far greater depth. Once again, an overview on the developmental relational approach, on developmental theory, childhood development, attachment, a whole hour of a primer on those topics and then applying that learning as a parent, applying it as an educator, and applying it as a direct service provider or somebody that works in policy. So for everybody tuning in or listening to this, know that there's more around the corner. Vinny, Celeste, thank you. And Deb, thank you so much for everything that you do for kids.
Thanks to all
Thank
of you.
you.
So nice to meet you, Vinny and Celeste. And
Yeah,
Brad.
thank
Same
you
here.
for having us.
Thank you.